Over the years, I've tried a few times to write a video on Portal 2. I've searched the game far and wide for that seed, the core idea that I could use as a foundation to write an entire video. But I've never really found anything that was worth a video. It's kind of obvious what makes this game so fantastic. Well, not too long ago, me and my friend decided to run through the game simultaneously and talk about what we saw as we went along. When we were discussing everything afterwards, we came to a conclusion that there really isn't a single smart character in the entire game. We jokingly call this the Moron theory.
I am not a moron!
Yes, you are.
That really interested me. This gigantic, insane place that is Aperture Science is the culmination of 100 of the most intelligent people in the world, working under the close command of a billionaire who sits somewhere between lunatic and moron, who held them back so much that none of these amazing inventions ever saw the light of day outside of this facility. It's like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory if the candy never actually made it to store shelves, all because every named character in the series is, well, a moron. I don't really like the idea of this being a lore channel, but this is basically a lore video. Think of it as a way for me to expose this really clever and unique writing stunt that Valve pulled with this game. Anyways, you've probably got a couple characters in your head who you think aren't morons but geniuses. Don't worry, I'll debunk those. But first, let's just go over some of the history of Aperture Science that we learn over this game. Basically, in the 50s, Cave Johnson was leading Aperture Fixtures, a military contractor producing shower curtains. He took his fortune that he earned from this and hired a ton of the world's top scientists, and basically had them working around the clock, just doing science at all costs, hoping to find some breakthrough invention to earn him and his company the next windfall, until eventually the whole company fell apart. Doing science at all costs. That's pretty much the basis for everything we see in Aperture Science, from the early days to what Wheatley does when he takes over the facility, to what happens between Glados and the co-op robots after Chell leaves. Let's start with the Cave Johnson era, before Glados was ever created. Like I said, this guy got a ton of money selling shower curtains to the military and used it to buy salt mines where his company, Aperture Science, would experiment and develop new technologies, hoping, of course, to become rich off of them. These scientists managed to invent the portal gun, the most amazing invention ever, but even after 50 years of serious refinement, it never made it out of the testing phase. Even though the portal gun was obviously the route to follow if he wanted to make a fortune, Cave continued having his lab boys just test everything. Seemingly, his business model was to just do as much science as is physically possible and then just wait for money to appear in his bank account. He'd take all of these people, these pillars of human achievement, and break their bones, replace their blood with gasoline, give them tumors only to cut them out later, get them to solve puzzles involving his technologies, inject mantis DNA into them, just doing science stuff with no real goal in mind. This line right here sums it up.
Just a heads up, we're going to have a superconductor turned up full blast and pointed at you for the duration of this next test. I'll be honest, we're throwing science at the wall here to see what sticks. No idea what it'll do. Probably nothing.
A lot of great people died for the sake of seeing what happens when humans have their blood replaced with gasoline, because somehow that was meant to generate a profit. After a decade or two of astronauts, war heroes, and Olympians running these often fatal tests, Cave didn't have the money to keep it up, so instead he started offering $60 to homeless people in exchange for letting him perform science on them. Basically the same sort of experiments. I guess it's just less expensive to kill a homeless person than it is to kill an Olympian. By this point, Cave is getting even more desperate for that scientific breakthrough that'll save his company, and he still isn't focusing on just selling the portal gun.
Again, all you gotta do is let us disassemble you. We're not banging rocks together here. We know how to put a man back together. So, that's a complete reassembly. New vitals, spit shine on the old ones, plus we're scooping out tumors. Frankly, you ought to be paying us.
Literally anything scientific, just do it. He'll get his lab boys to perform a heart transplant on you and you'll get another $60, because who knows, maybe Aperture Science is one heart surgery away from figuring out something profitable about heart surgeries. After another 10 years, Cave had totally run out of money. He couldn't afford to experiment on homeless people anymore, so instead, he started mandating that his own employees be test subjects, while Aperture was starting to develop AI technology so that Cave could cut costs further on human labor and human test subjects. One last Hail Mary from Cave was to buy $7 million worth of moon rocks, seemingly for no reason other than, it's the moon, of course it's going to be scientific. Well, it turns out that much moon dust is incredibly toxic, and so Cave and probably a lot of Aperture employees were lethally poisoned by this, experiment. However, unlike most of Aperture's history, there actually was a small scientific breakthrough here. Turns out, moon rocks act fantastically as portal conductors. So basically, all of these white portalable walls we see in the later phases of Aperture science are basically just covered in paint made from moon rocks. Cave was about to die, but he had one last theory to test.
We're going to see if jumping in and out of these new portals can somehow leach the lunar poison out of a man's bloodstream. When life gives you lemons, make lemonade.
This absolutely random and baseless theory, of course, didn't work. So Cave told his team to start developing brain mapping technology so that he could be put in a computer and live forever. And if they didn't get the technology in time to save him, to put Carolyn, his assistant or wife or something, into a computer instead, thus creating Glados.
Point is, if we can store music on a compact disc, why can't we store a man's intelligence and personality on one?
Cave Johnson devoted his entire life to doing scientific things. Not actually following the scientific method, but doing things that are just science adjacent. Surgeries, microchips in the brain, messing around with moon rocks, stuff like that. And puzzles. You know, something that I always wondered about Portal was how exactly solving a bunch of puzzles was supposed to help in the scientific process. Like, I get that we're testing the portal gun and the repulsion gel and all of that stuff, but why puzzles? Like, if the portal gun works, it works. Why bother testing how intelligently people are able to use it? It's because, again, Cave Johnson is a moron. Puzzles have something to do with science, right? After all, it's not like we can sell the portal gun until we know whether or not this one homeless guy is able to use it to spray paint all over the place, right? Cave Johnson spent his entire life looking for the next huge scientific breakthrough, even though his company created a world-changing product half a century before anyone else was even close to that, and then just didn't tell anyone about it, because he's a moron. Some of my friends fight me about this, but I'm not aware of a single piece of evidence in the game that Cave Johnson is anything more than a moron who got lucky selling shower curtains once. Seriously, I can't name a single smart or well-informed decision he's ever made in canon, or a single time he seemed to actually understand what his own company was doing. And yet, because his moronic patterns led him to spending money in a very particular way, such as employing genius scientists, he basically became the most important person in the entire fiction of Half-Life. I'm gonna go on a little tangent here for a moment. Really, this video is meant to just expose how funny and clever the general plot structure of Portal 2 is, and this tangent might be the funniest thing about the game to me. So, Half-Life may very well be the most important game series of all time in terms of its impact and how it's advanced the whole concept of game design so many times over. It's known for its fantastic story, its grim dystopian setting, and its commitment to dense and consistent world building. However, in an incredibly bold move by Valve, they introduced the absolutely stupid world of Portal into the canon of their incredibly serious flagship series. While all of these dramatic, world-changing events are happening on the surface, just below, in some random salt mine in a destroyed Michigan, the most ridiculous story ever is unfolding, and absolutely nobody has any idea it's happening. Only like 6 people even know what Aperture Science is by the time of Half-Life 2. So I'll try to keep the Half-Life part of this video brief, but basically in Half-Life, the Combine are able to teleport from their home dimension into ours, but once they're in our dimension, they rely on local transportation, no more teleporting. The only reason the Combine don't just completely wipe out humanity while harvesting Earth is because a couple humans are on the cusp of developing that local teleportation technology, exactly what they're looking for. If the Combine had access to localized teleporting, they would just kill every last human without a second thought. Well, Eli, Judith, Kleiner, and Alex aren't really on the cutting edge of teleporter technology. As it turns out, Aperture Science figured out teleportation about 70 years earlier, only Cave Johnson was such a moron that he spent the rest of his life refining this already incredible civilization-reshaping technology, rather than just getting it in people's hands as soon as possible. And so only a few portal guns actually exist, and nobody left alive after the Combine got here has any idea that localized teleporting has already been a thing for 70 years. So, long story short, if Cave Johnson wasn't one of the biggest morons in all of fiction, humanity would have gone extinct long before the events of Half-Life 2. Awesome. Before we move on to Glados, I think it's important that we talk for a moment about what exactly Aperture Science does after Cave Johnson dies. Well, basically the exact same thing, because Glados is both a moron and a computer designed per Cave's instructions. She just uses Aperture Science to do sciencey things, basically aimlessly. We've already talked about how pointless the actual puzzles are, puzzles which she's designed to endlessly crave to the point of getting withdrawals when nobody's solving puzzles in front of her. But then we got to what might be the most pointless and cruel thing that Aperture Science does. It's something that's surrounding us throughout the entirety of both games. So, I don't know if this reading of the Portal series is the most widespread or not, but basically, the way I see it, almost everything in Aperture Science is sentient. If you want some evidence of this in Portal 1, you can watch an old crusty video I did on that game called Portal: Cracks in the System. But looking just at Portal 2, I mean, we've got the sentient nanobots that are repairing this elevator shaft, at least alive enough to be talked into hiring Wheatley. We've got these wall panels who very much look frustrated when they're jammed in place. Glados refers to some parts of the test chambers in a way that seems to recognize their sentience, calling the door mainframe he instead of it, saying he won't be living anymore. She says that this faith plate is letting out a distress code rather than an error code. We see that certain turrets have distinct personalities, and we even hear Glados say this.
I think that one was about to say, I love you. They are sentient, of course. We just have a lot of them.
Like I said, I've covered some more of the first game's evidence for this in a different video, and I don't want to spend all day treading old ground, but Portal 1 even subtly hints that the portal gun itself is sentient, and at this point, if Aperture Science is all about just doing as many scientific things as possible, why not just make every single thing with a computer in it sentient if you have that kind of processing power? I mean, screw it, maybe we'll learn something about artificial life if we make sure that these boxes, destined to be abandoned for thousands of years, can feel boredom. So next up, we've got Glados. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, Glados isn't a moron, she's a genius, but just insane. Well, to talk about Glados, first we've got to talk about Carolyn. Frankly, I don't know what the wiki might say about her, maybe there's some cut line that actually goes against this idea, but as with Cave, I don't see any evidence in this entire game, that's actually in the game, that Carolyn is anything more than, well, basically a ditzy trophy wife at best, or a hot assistant to keep Cave company at worst.
Say goodbye, Carolyn.
Goodbye, Carolyn.
She is a gem.
Really, the closest thing we get to evidence of the contrary is Glados saying that the itch didn't bother her because she was always in it for the science. Personally, I attribute that line to the personality cores that she had in the first game, noting the fact that she acts a lot differently in Portal 2 without them. But anyways, we never hear Cave say anything like, Carolyn says that the moon rocks, yada yada yada. It's always, the lab boys say that the moon rocks, you get my point. So wife, or just assistant, it really seems like Carolyn is just, well, a moron that Cave fell in love with. Well, what happens when a totally stupid person is put into a supercomputer and suddenly has access to all of human history, miles worth of machinery, and millions of MIPS worth of processing power?
How about now? Now who's a moron? Could a moron hunt you into this pit? Ah! Could a moron do that?
They go insane. Glados, that is to say Carolyn's dumbass mind put into a supercomputer, almost immediately started killing everybody the moment she was activated.
I flooded the enrichment center with a deadly neurotoxin.
And funnily enough, we see this exact same thing happen in Portal 2 with Wheatley. He's an absolute moron by design, and the moment he's put into a supercomputer, he starts acting just as erratically and violently towards Chell as Glados did. So, hey, that's something that Glados and Wheatley had in common. They were both morons that were suddenly given petabytes worth of information and immediately started acting violently. The only difference is that Glados had personality cores attached to her, which helped to nullify the violent moron inside of her and make her act more rationally. I mean, God, look how childishly rude she's being to Chell over the course of this game, now that she doesn't have the personality cores keeping her head on straight.
Remember before when I was talking about smelly garbage standing around being useless? That was a metaphor. I was actually talking about you. And I'm sorry. You didn't react at the time, so I was worried it sailed right over your head, which would have made this apology seem insane. That's why I had to call you garbage a second time just now.
Wheatley, though, he never had the crutch that is personality cores. Needless to say, Wheatley's a massive moron. This is literally explained to us by Glados.
He's the product of the greatest minds of a generation, working together with the express purpose of building the dumbest moron who ever lived.
Although, as a side note, so that I have something interesting to say about this little guy, as far as I can tell, this scene where he's trying to get his new invention, the Frankencube, to complete a test, Seems to be the only instance in either Portal game of somebody actually performing a scientific experiment, which is just genius. That reminds me of one other hilarious detail that isn't really relevant, but that I'd be remiss not to bring up. When Glados tries to fry Wheatley's mind with the logical paradox, Wheatley is too stupid to understand that it even is a paradox. But all of the Frankencubes are instantly destroyed, meaning that these boxes with legs are smarter than Wheatley is.
Right, paradox time. This sentence is false. Don't think about it.
True. I'll go true. Yeah, that was easy.
Anyways, we've got one last named character to cover. Chell, the player character. She's an interesting one. All she really does over both games is prove her intelligence by solving puzzles. It doesn't really feel right to call her a moron, but, well, she does have brain damage, as this fantastic fourth wall breaking joke in the beginning shows us.
Just tell me, just say yes. Okay, what you're doing there is jumping. You just jumped. But never mind, say apple. Apple. Okay, you know what? That's close enough. Just hold tight.
It's my personal headcanon that Chell, from this moment on, thinks that speaking is the same thing as jumping, and so every time a puzzle demands that she jump, she just tries to speak. But enough about that. The point is, while the world is being harvested and humanity is fighting tooth and nail with its last dying breath on the surface, somewhere underground, a moron didn't realize that he should start selling the most incredible invention ever, and instead he went on to build a facility so incredible that it could be considered the 8th wonder of the world, so that he could get his ditzy wife to go into a supercomputer, where her and a million other tiny AIs would develop their own culture without humans, and collect centuries worth of practically useless data that no human would ever even get a chance to glimpse at, save for a single brain-damaged mute lunatic, who put history's greatest moron in charge of a dozen or so nuclear reactors, resulting in the facility falling apart and her teleporting the ultimate moron onto the surface of the moon. Half-Life has some of the most discussed and analyzed lore in the history of gaming, but somewhere out there within that lore, there's just this one little space where one of gaming's most ridiculous stories is unfolding, and that's just genius. Really, 40 kids all doing potato batteries for the Bring Your Daughter to Work Day science fair is just the perfect metaphor for everything that Aperture Science did from the 1950s to whatever distant future this game takes place in. Nobody's proving or disproving anything, but, well, building a potato battery is kind of like science, right? Let's spend our whole life building potato batteries over and over again, and wait for the scientific breakthroughs and the military contracts and the money to flow in. Right, Cave? Before I close out today's video, I'd like to just verbally thank my patrons, especially those who are donating $10 or more monthly, such as Ada Avery, Almost Dead Again, Anatoly Volnov, Andrew Melnick, Ben N., Benny, Big Time Jim, Bobby Blitz, Celadon, Colin Gajic, Cornelius Nelson, Darius Fazier, Demise, Dennis Vashakamer, Dominic Johan, Fralem, George Rosenbaum, IJK, Kenneth Endfinger, Laffy, Mixer Rules, Neurofilter, Of Lucian, PJ, Raxvan, Robert Boting, CeeLo, Shano, Yemen Shi, Zoe, and Zyrobly. I'd also like to extend these thanks to just everybody who decided to stay subscribed after my announcement a couple days ago. Needless to say, I've been horrified about it, so hopefully things are going okay so far. But with that, I hope you have a great February.